No mai haere mai, kia ora, and welcome along to Shine Today, ko Andrew Urquhart tēnei. Today we're talking about life, in particular the end stages of life. My special guest is someone who has walked with hundreds of New Zealanders as they've approached their final moments in her role as a hospice chaplain. We welcome Sister Jacqui Ryan. Sister, kia ora, thank you for your time today.
Kia ora, thank you.
Firstly, we're going to be talking about your role as a hospice chaplain, but firstly, could you tell us about your vocation, your calling to being a Dominican sister?
Sure. I entered the Dominican Sisters in 1982, so that makes it 40 years now since I've been a Dominican sister. During a good period of that time, I was a secondary school teacher and then moved into some chaplaincy work, both secondary school, industrial chaplaincy, and then that took me to a very different space when I worked for Christian World Service, looking at poverty and justice issues. And then from there I came back to hospice, which has been fabulous.
So God has called you through a variety of callings and placements and positions. What drew you in particular to hospice chaplaincy?
Back in 2000, I was at a bit of a loose end, looking for some work, further work to do with chaplaincy. And a friend who was at Mercy Hospital at that stage in Mountain Road called me and asked if I would be prepared to come and do some hospital chaplaincy work. Yep. And from there I also moved upstairs to what was then the St Joseph's Hospice Ward, and I was introduced to hospice chaplaincy. And I found that a very interesting and fulfilling role, and thought to myself, at some stage I hope to come back to this.
Okay, so a definite sense of calling in that regard. Talk to us about hospice, particularly the chaplaincy, but people probably have different ideas about what it is and what it isn't. What is hospice work from your point of view?
I think sometimes people think that hospice is a very gloomy, dark, end-of-life, depressive place.
God's waiting room, as
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think really, and from my own experience, it's anything but. Of course it is a place where people die. It is a place where people come when they're in pain. But my experience is that the staff and the general atmosphere of hospice allows people to be who they are in whatever state they are when they arrive with us. So some people are simply coming for a look to see what hospice might be like for their future care. Other people are there to receive treatment, symptom treatment, and other folk come to us at the very end stage when it is time for them to act, what I would call actively die.
At any stage, and the different sort of people that you mentioned there, I suppose for each one of those stories, it involves people confronting their mortality, confronting that if not now, then at some point we will pass away. That can be a very difficult thing for some people.
Indeed, and I think perhaps for younger people that's a much more serious and confronting question, as the word you use, than perhaps for older folk. I think we have an idea that we will live a good span of life. In New Zealand, most people do. However, when someone is hit with a terminal illness or an end-of-life illness, life-limiting illness, different words used for the same thing, and they're younger, that really then is very confronting, especially for a wife or husband with small children. And I have certainly ministered to people of that nature.
I imagine for people of faith that can be quite confronting as well, quite challenging to their faith. They believe in a God who loves and cares for them, and then it almost seems unfair that, especially for younger people, that this diagnosis comes. Is that something that you talk about in your role as chaplain?
I think one of the things that I do when I meet people is I meet them where they are at. And I think that's perhaps one of the most important things for a chaplain or a spiritual carer. In some hospices we're known as a spiritual carer, is to meet people where they're at. And if they have been a churchgoer or a person of faith, and that doesn't seemed to be working for them at that time, then that's where we go with perhaps the questions and the support. But there are many people, of course, who come to hospice who have no faith, but they have a spirituality.
Yeah.
And I think that is really key to discover, where is people's spirituality? Where are they on that spiritual journey? They may not have a doctrine faith like a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist, but they certainly have some spiritual leaning.
And some belief systems, I suppose, that go with it as well.
Absolutely, yes.
For your own point of view, as a person of faith, does that help you? Does that equip you in your role as a chaplain?
Oh, absolutely. I would say that my own faith, my own experience of living with other sisters, working in schools, seeing people come from different areas of life, different walks of life, also perhaps the early death of my mother at 75, who was receiving palliative care, though she did not die of cancer. That taught me a lot about the process of dying.
For somebody in the role as a hospital chaplain then, yes, faith is important, but also, I mean, as you were talking about, life experience. You need to put it crudely, a few miles on the clock in order to be a chaplain. Do you think? What's your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, if you were to ask perhaps a 22 or 23-year-old to do this work, I think, I'm not sure that they'd be interested for a start, but I definitely think that life experiences is something that you need. You need to have gone through some ups and downs in your own life. You need to have perhaps questioned your own faith at times. You also need to be the kind of person that someone feels they can open up to, and that they feel comfortable with, knowing that whatever they say to you is sacred, special, and you will respect it.
This is a role that you've been in for 8 years, I understand.
Correct.
Does it take its toll, I suppose, emotionally, spiritually, being with people through the last stages of life? And would it be perhaps too hard to describe it as heartbreaking at times?
Absolutely. And I would say that if you're in this kind of work and you have no emotional release, no emotional feeling, and no capacity to be able to deal with that, then you're in the wrong place. Yeah. And there have been times when I've come from a room or a meeting with a patient and their family, and it's just felt very heavy. And so one of the things that I used to do is, we had a quiet room, some people would call it a sanctuary, and I would just go in there and simply sit and look out the window, sometimes at a beautiful tui on the kowhai tree, and just be able to come back into myself and deal with that, pray, but often also discuss that perhaps with another staff member who is dealing with the same patient, because they're experiencing some of that difficulty as well.
I don't want to paint the picture that chaplaincy, again, is all doom and gloom,
No,
in the same way
not at all.
that hospice isn't necessarily a gloomy place. During your experience, how has that made you a better person? What things has God, what treasures has God brought to you during this time?
Wow, where do I begin is probably the right answer. Sometimes I've come away feeling, those of us who have experienced this, no matter what walk of life we've been in, that God was right there in that experience. And you don't have those every day, you don't have those with every connection, but sometimes just simply coming away and feeling the power of God in that is quite amazing. And sometimes there are very few people that you might want to share that with, because it's just such a precious moment. Hilarity and humour is something that's actually very important too. Very early on in my chaplaincy work, there was a chap who forgot my name, and he introduced his wife to Charlie Chaplin, me. And those who know me well know that I have a great sense of humour.
Oh, good.
And so I said to him, look, if you have to call me Charlie Chaplin to remember who I am,
Yeah.
that's absolutely
Just get you a
fine by
bowler
me.
hat, right?
And some of my staff members, fellow staff members, they started to call me Charlie Chaplin as well.
good.
In fact, at one stage I had a little picture of Charlie Chaplin on my door.
Oh,
so,
nice.
you know, there's that kind of thing. But there's also humour that you can have with patients. Little things happen, and so I think it's as I said earlier, it's not the gloomy kind of place that people think that hospice is.
It is still true, though, that if somebody's ended up in hospice,
Sure.
it hasn't been a good year. The circumstances that have led to that point. Can you talk to us about what people are going through, not just medically, but also emotionally, spiritually as well? How do you connect with people in those spaces?
Many years ago, I did a Māori theology paper with a very eminent Catholic priest, Father Hanare Tate from Northland. And I remember Pa Tate saying, engage with the person to the point of encounter.
Yeah.
Find out where that common space is and go from there.
Yeah.
And that was my guiding way of coming to know patients, was through that point of encounter. And sometimes it might have been that we had something in common, like a hobby. It might have been that we had our faith in common. It could have been anything, really. And that was what started the encounter. Very rarely would I go in and kind of pose the heavy questions first. It's about enabling trust and inviting trust, because if people don't trust you, they're not going to open up to those really important, significant issues in their life.
As a chaplain, you're engaging, of course, with the people at the hospice for palliative care, but also with friends, with family members, with loved ones as well. I imagine that different people responding to grief differently, that can be a complex situation, perhaps the patient dealing with the mortality better than their loved ones?
I think sometimes that's absolutely correct. For family who are waiting, kind of on the side, they're on the periphery, but they're right in there as well. And the waiting can be extraordinarily tiring, very emotional. The patient is going through the journey that they go through. And it's very difficult for loved ones to watch.
So as a chaplain, you care for the loved ones as well as the patient?
Absolutely, both. And sometimes it might be that the patient's family want to have some time with me personally, or have a one-on-one with me, or sometimes they're not so comfortable with me in the room, actually, with the patient. So if I go into a room, went into a room where there was a patient with family, I'd simply address the family and the patient, of course, and say, are you okay about me being here at this time, or would you prefer that I come back when you're on your own? And there were both responses to both.
With the hospice organisation, the role of chaplains, I mean, there's many different people within the hospice environment. There's palliative care specialists and nurses and all sorts of people. But the necessity of a chaplain to deal with some of the spiritual side, that's seen as an essential part of the team?
Yes, and I think there would be very few hospices, well, in fact, I can't think of any that wouldn't see spiritual care as a really key component. I often say when I'm explaining the work of a chaplain or a spiritual carer, we talk about body, soul and mind. So I reverse that a little bit and I say body, spirit and mind. And people can kind of get that. They know that their body is deteriorating, or that their body has been impacted in some way. Their mind is going through all the things that they need to consider and think about when they have their particular in life-limiting illness, but also their spiritualness, their spiritual journey, whatever that may be. And some people have said to me, oh, I'm not spiritual, and then I look at them and I say, really? I actually think that we all are spiritual, but maybe in your life you may not have paid too much attention to that. How about we explore some of that now? So that's a very gentle way of working with people.
For the person who is in the hospice for end-of-life care,
Yes.
it's kind of like a processing, a saying goodbye, a letting go in some ways. Do you find that for the patient as well, there is stages of grief, there's a grief process happening for them as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I know people sometimes say, oh, they're in denial. I find it really hard to believe that when somebody is facing a life-limiting illness and they know that their life is coming to an end fairly soon, in what I would call the more active stage of dying,
Yeah.
that they are not going through some kind of grief. The grief of giving up their family,
Yeah.
the grief of giving up a career that they were involved in, the grief of just knowing that life as they lived it, with all its joys, with all its complexities, is going to end.
Yeah.
That is a real grief for people, and especially for young children who see a daddy or a mummy
Yeah.
coming to the end of life. That's really, really hard.
Do you have the opportunity within that context to talk about faith issues? I mean, you were saying before, meet them where they're at. But is it appropriate, or do you have opportunity to share the hope that you have?
I do, and I certainly do that with people of Christian faith. I do that with people actually of all faiths, to be honest, whether they're Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, because there is in their journey a belief in something greater too.
Yeah.
I think perhaps what's hardest is for people who come who have very little experience of what I would call a faith journey.
Yeah.
They have a spiritual journey, but a faith journey is just that much deeper, that much further on in one's understanding of who one is in relation to God or the great other or the higher power. Some people use those terms. Interesting.
Is that harder for you to process? People who, I mean, as people of faith, we have a hope and a future, but for people who don't have a faith, who don't believe in God or the afterlife, is that more difficult for you personally to process their passing? Is there a struggle there?
Interesting question. I would say that perhaps the biggest thing that I, as a spiritual carer or chaplain, need to put down or lay down is non-judgment.
Yeah.
And so however people want to die, whatever their journey is in dying, that is their journey. And my job is there not to judge that, but to support them and walk with them as they journey towards their end of life. And some believe that there is nothing after life.
Yeah.
That's not my belief, but that is where they are at. And my job was
Yeah.
to keep journeying with them, keep being that support, keep being that compassionate heart
Yeah.
that they needed right to the end.
Things, of course, changed in New Zealand with the introduction of the End-of-Life Choice Bill, which personally think is a bit of a misnomer, but anyway, that has become legislation. How has that changed hospice work and palliative care? Have you seen the impact of that legislation on the work that you've been doing?
All of our staff certainly went through significant training around that. My work from then until I left my position in chaplaincy was for about 6 months. Working with people who are wanting assisted dying is complex.
Yeah.
The reasons that they want assisted dying or they want to die earlier than perhaps normal sometimes actually come down to simple questions like, what's the pain going to be like? What's my life going to be like? How can I deal with that? And sometimes the medical staff can come in and give them that information, which may allay that fear. In fact, it's often fear that people need, that people are questioning rather. So being able to look at that fear straight in the eye through counselling, through spiritual care work, through work with a medical doctor, our senior staff. Sometimes people then decide, well, actually, this isn't what I need. I'm not saying that everybody changes their mind at all. Assisted dying, as I say, is a very complex issue. The situation I was at Harbour Hospice, which was where I was employed, was that the hospice was a conscientious objector to the bill and to the Act, and therefore the place that the hospice is at is that it will not support the use of its facilities nor its staff to support assisted dying. However, having said that, all of the issues that people need, social worker, counselling, spiritual care, medical, nursing work, all of that is open to even those people right to the moment where they choose.
With your work as a hospice chaplain, before the legislation passed, I'm sure you would have seen so many examples of that, of people being given the opportunity to die with dignity, that is a core value, I suppose, in the area of hospice care. Would that be right?
Absolutely. Dignity, compassion, all of those things that you and I would want as we die, and which inevitably we will, all of those things that we want are the things that staff are called to and offer patients. Absolutely.
The work of hospice in New Zealand is absolutely incredible, and I'm not sure where we'd be as a nation without the wonderful people such as yourself who do amazing work. What will be remarkable to some people watching this is that this is charities for most places. They sell second-hand clothes and baked goods in order to raise the funds for what is such an essential service for a part of life that's going to happen to all of us. For people watching, how can they support hospice? I know that if it's your life experience that perhaps a loved one has passed, everybody gets it, everybody's a fan, but we don't have to wait until those life circumstances in order to support our local hospice.
Correct. Well, I guess there's a multitude of ways. Some people will donate money, and you can become a regular donor. You can go on a regular donors list at your local hospice. You can give a one-off donation. You might like to do something, have a little tea party, or organise a golf tournament, or a round of tennis or something, and get sponsored. I mean, sponsorship is an amazing way that people can organise those things. The other big one, of course, that hospices rely on hugely are their volunteers. People who can sit with others in their homes, people who can come and help with the delivery of food to patients' rooms, people who can drive patients to appointments. There's a myriad of ways in which people can become volunteers. So there's lots and lots of different ways, and just about any way you can think of. But yes, hospice shops, please support hospice shops. They really need that at the moment. COVID was very difficult, particularly for all charities, but I know hospices, their income went down significantly during that period.
We talked at the beginning about your own calling, both broadly and then specifically to hospice chaplaincy. What would you say to somebody who's watching this and perhaps feeling that tug of maybe this is what God is calling me to do? We've also talked about how it's not for everyone, it can be difficult. What would you say to somebody who is saying, hey, maybe this is for me, maybe this is what God's calling me to do?
Well, ring up your local hospice and ask to speak to the spiritual carer or the chaplain. Go and have a chat. I think it's important that people come to this work with a qualification. Now, people will say, well, okay, a piece of paper doesn't make the job, and that's true. But in the process of gaining a qualification, and there are many ways that can be done in New Zealand, you'll learn about the deeper issues. You'll learn about the medical issues, about so much more. So just having a heart full of love is the perfect start. But
That's what you need for volunteers, but you need qualifications for a calling, perhaps. Is that correct?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
You need education, just like in every work that people go into. Yep.
What can we pray for hospital chaplains and for hospice chaplains and hospice generally?
I think we can pray that the staff and hospice chaplains, I'd like to say this, or hospice spiritual carers, are part of a large group of staff. Our work is maybe about that much in the whole organisation. And so my prayer would be that all staff know and understand more fully the beauty of life and the process of journeying towards death, but also life in that death as well.
Yeah. Sister Jacqui, thank you so much for the work that you have done. We wish you all the best in what God calls you to do next, but thank you for being on the program. Kia ora.
Thank you very much.
If this conversation has led you to seek further answers about end-of-life care or to find out how to support hospice and palliative care in New Zealand, here are a few websites that you may wish to visit. hospice.org.nz, pcca.nz, defendnz.co.nz, familyfirst.org.nz and nathaniel.org.nz. And also encourage you to pray that God, the source of hope, will fill you completely with joy and peace because you trust in Him. Then you will overflow with confident hope through the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.